Greetings to the gods. Welcome back to my channel. We're continuing today, Encyclopedia Britannica, 1910, Banks and Banking. We're continuing from private banks. To return to early history of banking, thus, as no bank could be formed with more than 6 partners during the whole of the period from 1694 to 1826 and 1833, the majority of the banks formed throughout England and Wales for more than a century were necessarily small and usually isolated firms. Further, when a partner died, his capital not infrequently went out of the business. Then a fresh partner with sufficient means had to be found. Constant change was the result, and confidence, quote, a plant of slow growth, end quote, could not thrive, except in those instances when a son or a relation filled the vacancy. The banks in the country districts had frequently branches in the small market towns close to them. Those in London had never more than one office. These banks were sometimes powerful and generally well managed, a considerable number being established by members of the Society of Friends. The restriction of partners in private banks to the number of 6 continued till 1862. By the Act of that year, they were allowed to be 10. This power, however, did not extend to issuing private banks, which were restricted to 6 partners as before. The power of increasing bank partnerships to 10 has been made but little use of. The difficulties of carrying on business on a large scale by private firms were augmented by certain legal technicalities which practically rendered large private banks impossible in ordinary circumstances. Hence, banking business did not begin to assume its present form till almost halfway through the 19th century. The gradual change followed the passing of the Acts of 1826 and to 1833, of 1844 to 1845, and of 1862 and of 1879. Incidentally, the Act of 1844 had an unexpected influence on the constitution of the banking system. After favoring the existence of small banks for many years, it gradually led, as the time arrived when the establishment of large and powerful banks in England and Wales became necessary, to their formation. No new bank of issue whatever was allowed to be established. Restrictions were placed on the English issuing banks. Private issuing banks with not more than 6 partners were allowed to remain, to amalgamate with other private issuing banks, and to retain their joint issues. The joint stock banks which possessed issues were also allowed to continue these. But when 2 joint stock banks amalgamated, the continuing bank only retained its issue. Also, when a private issuing bank was formed into or joined a joint stock bank, the issue lapsed. The greater number of provincial banks in England and Wales had been banks of issue up to 1844. The Act of 1844 restricted their power of issuing notes, which at that date and even subsequently continued to be of importance to them, in such a manner that, as Sir R. H. Inglis Palgrave stated in giving evidence before the Committee of the House of Commons at the Banking Inquiry of 1875, these banks possessed in their issues a property they could use, but were not able to sell. The statistics forming part of Appendix 14 to the report of the Select Committee of the House of Commons on Banks of Issue 1875 give interesting information as to the proportion of notes in circulation to the deposits of banks in various districts of the country and at various dates. The statements were supplied by 21 banks some in agricultural districts, some in places where manufacturers flourished, some in mixed districts, commercial and agricultural, or industrial and manufacturing. In all of these, the inquiry being carried as far back as 1844. The proportion of the circulation to the banking deposits had greatly diminished in recent years. In several cases, the deposits had increased threefold in the time. In one case, it was 5 times as large, in another, nearly 7 times, in another, nearly 12 and a half times. The proportion of the circulation to the deposits had very largely diminished in that time. In one instance, from being about 1/3 of the deposits, at which proportion it had remained for 5 years consecutively, it fell to 9% at the end of the term. In another, from being 22%, it had diminished to 1.5% of the total. In all cases where the detail was given, it had diminished greatly. The Bank Act of 1844 was arranged with the intention of concentrating the note issues on the Bank of England in order to secure the monopoly of that bank as the one issuer in England and Wales. The result was that nearly all the provincial banks in England had by 1906 lost the right of issue. Doubtless, all were destined to do so before long, a result by which banking in England and the industries of the country must lose the advantage which the local issues have been to Scotland and Ireland. Had the English country banks been allowed, as the Scottish bank, had the English country banks been allowed, as the Scottish banks were, to associate together and to retain their issues, powerful banks would many years since have been established throughout England and Wales, and the amalgamations of recent years would have been carried through at a much earlier date, and on terms much more favorable to the public. Security of note issue. No security was ever required to be given. No security was ever required to be given for the local issues in the United Kingdom. The provisions of the Acts of 1844 to 1845, which compelled the Irish and Scottish banks to hold specie against the notes issued beyond the legal limit, do not make the coin held a security for them. The legislation of 1879, which made the note issues a first charge with unlimited liability on the total assets of the joint stock banks, which accepted the principle of limited liability for the rest of their business, has been the only recognition by the state of the duty to the note holders of rendering them secure. It has been a real disadvantage to England that this duty has never been sufficiently recognized, and that the provincial note issue, which is a very convenient power for a bank to possess, and incidentally a considerable advantage to its customers, has been swept away without any attempt being made to remedy its deficiencies. There may be objections raised to a note circulation secured by the bonds of the government, but the security of the note issues of the national banks of the United States made against such bonds has scarcely ever been questioned. A different policy was followed by Sir Robert Peel in Scotland and in Ireland from that which he established in England. By the Acts of 1844 to 1845, the Scottish and Irish banks were allowed to exceed their authorized issues on holding specie to the amount of the excess, and no restrictions were placed on amalgamations among banks in these countries. In Scotland and in Ireland, notes for less than £5 continue to be allowed. The result has been that the 10 large banks in Scotland and 6 of the 9 banks in Ireland possess the power of issuing notes. The large proportion of local branches in these countries has been greatly assisted by this power. Originally, besides the Bank of England, nearly all the provincial banks in England and Wales possessed the privilege of issue. These banks continued their operations as previously during the time while the Bank Act was discussed in Parliament. And this part is amongst in circulation. When the arrangements which that act created were made public, 9 banks, of which 8 were private and 1 was a joint stock bank, ceased to issue their notes prior to the 12th of October 1844. When the act came into operation, of these, the Western District Joint Stock Banking Company was dissolved. One of the private banks was closed. The remaining 7 issued Bank of England notes and were allowed certain privileges for doing this. By the Act of 1844, the maximum circulation of the English issuing banks was fixed at the average circulation of the 12 weeks before the 27th of April 1844. The number of the banks to which the privilege of circulation was then allowed and the amount of notes permitted were in England. And we have a breakdown here of the number of banks to which the privilege of circulation was then allowed. We have 207 private banks with an authorized issue of £5 million, 72 joint stock banks with an authorized issue of £3 million, totaling £8 million. The actual circulation of the country in October 1844 was as follows. We had notes in circulation, the monthly return of the circulation ending the 12th of October 1844, stamps and taxes 25th of October. All right, so England, yeah, Bank of England, 20 million notes in circulation. Private banks, 4 million. Joint stock banks, 3 million. Scotland, chartered private and joint stock banks, 2 million in circulation. Ireland, Bank of Ireland, 3 million in circulation. Private and joint stock banks, 2 million in circulation. Total, 37 million in circulation. In May 1907, the number and amounts were reduced to, so it was reduced to 12 private banks, 482,000 pounds authorized issue, and the actual issue was 122,000 pounds. You had 17 joint stock banks. They were authorized to issue 1 million, and they had 437,000 actual issue. So the reason why the actual circulation of these banks is so far below the authorized issue is that under existing circumstances, their circulation can only extend over a very limited area. The notes of country banks are now almost unknown except in the immediate neighborhood of the places where they are issued. Though they may all be payable in London, yet there is often considerable difficulty in getting them cashed. The average circulation in 1906 was as follows. Bank of England, 28 million. Private banks, 124,000. Joint stock banks, 429,000. Total in England, 29 million. Scotland, 7 million. Ireland, 6 million. Total in United Kingdom, 43 million pounds. So this shows an apparent increase of more than 6 million since 1844. The decrease of the country circulation in England and the increase of the Scottish and Irish circulations may be set off against each other. The increase is mainly in the notes of the Bank of England. In 1844, the number of banking offices in England and Wales was 976, while in 1906 there were more than 5,880. Each of these offices must hold some till money, and of this Bank of England notes almost always form a part. So the till money, the Bank of England notes almost always form part of the till money. Hence, it is probable that a large part of the increase in the circulation of the Bank of England since 1844 is held in the tills of the banks in England and Wales, and that the active note circulation of the United Kingdom is but little larger than it was. It may be added that the government received from the note circulation for a typical year ending 5th of April 1904, out of the profits of issue, Bank of England, £184,000, and also composition for the duties on the bills and notes of the Banks of England and Ireland and of country bankers, £120,000. In 1906, the banking business of England was carried on practically by about 10 private and 60 joint stock banks, of which more than one was properly a private firm under a joint stock form of organization. Though the number of individual banks had diminished, the offices had greatly increased. The records of the numbers of banks in the United Kingdom, having up to quite recent years been very imperfect, such as exists, were made by individual observers. The banks of England and Wales are believed to have been 350 in number in 1792. Those registered from 1826 to 1842 were private joint stock. So 1826 to 1842, you had 554 in 1826. In 27, you had 465. The number kept going down. In 1826, joint stock, you had none in 26. In 27, you had 6. In 33, you had 35. And in 42, you had 118. The number of banking offices in England and Wales was estimated by Mr. William Leatham in 1840 as being 697. The Banking Almanac for 1845 gives the number in 1844 for England and Wales as 336 private bank offices and 640 joint stock offices. Scotland, 368 offices, Ireland, 180. The number of inhabitants to each office was as follows in 1844 and 1906. So we have a table here: England and Wales, Isle of Man, Scotland, Ireland, in the United Kingdom. Number of banking offices. In 1844, England and Wales 976. In 1906, 5,527. In the Isle of Man, nil. In 1906, 23. Scotland 368. In 1906, 1180. In Ireland 180. In 1906, 777. In the United Kingdom 1,524. In 1906, 7,507. The number of inhabitants to each office. In 1884, you had 16,305 inhabitants in England and Wales to each office. So each office, so 976 multiplied by 16,305 in 1884. That is the amount of inhabitants to each office. In 1906, it was down to 5,885 because now we have more banks. Isle of Man inhabitants, well, it had none in 1844. In 1906, 2,417. 7,120 in Scotland, 3,790 in 1906. Ireland 45,417 to every 108 to every one office of 180. In 1906, it had 5,738 inhabitants. And in the United Kingdom, so forth, you had 1524. 1750, 526, and 5530. So the more banks they captured less inhabitants. So every one bank in 1906 in the United Kingdom captured 5,530 inhabitants. So in the latter years of the 18th century, and the early years of the 19th, the note circulation was a very important part of the business. But about that date, the deposits began to be, as they have continued since, far more important. The deposits began to be, as they have continued since, far more important. So in the 18th century, 17, back in those times, remember they were using specie, gold and silver, assets, substance, tangible things as deposits. It is unfortunately impossible to give any trustworthy statistics of the position of banking in the United Kingdom extending back for more than 40 or 50 years. Even the Scottish banks, who have been less reticent as to their position than the English banks, did not publish their accounts generally till 1865. I wonder why. The figures of the total deposits and cash balances in the Irish joint stock banks were published collectively from the year 1840 by the care of Dr. Neilson Hancock. But it is only of quite recent years that any statement of the general position other than an estimate has been possible, owing to the long continued reluctance of many banks to allow any publication of their balance sheets. I wonder why. A paper by W. Newmarch, printed in the Journal of the Statistical Society for 1851, supplies the earliest basis for a trustworthy estimate. According to this, the total amount of deposits, including the Bank of England, in England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland, may have been at that date from £250 million to £360 million. The estimate in Palgrave's notes on bank in 1872, excluding deposits in discount houses and the capitals of banks, was from £430 million to £450 million. The corresponding amounts at the close of 1906 were in wrong figures, including acceptances, etc. £997 million. The total resources, including capitals and reserves and note circulation in wrong figures, £177,500,000 were for 1906. So you had the England and Wales, Bank of England and other banks, 922,297,000 pounds. You had Scotland, 135 million, Ireland, 73 million, Isle of Man, 898,000. That gives you 1,131,944,000. Right? The progressive growth in bank deposits, since it has been possible to keep a record of their amounts, affords some means of checking roughly the correctness of the estimates of 1851 and 1872. So broadly speaking, it may be said that the bank deposits of the United Kingdom have about doubled since 1872. Now we go on to clearing. So the purely city banks had associated themselves in a clearing house. Certainly by 1776, an entry in the books of the Grasshopper, we have a footnote. Anytime you see a writing in the text and there's a number, that's a reference to a footnote. So you just go to the bottom of the page and look for the number at the end of the phrase or the statement or the sentence, and you'll see the recurring number, and that will be representative of that portion of the text you just read. So it says that an entry in the books of the Grasshopper, 1, the Grasshopper in Lombard Street by John Biddulph, Masters, 1892. Namely, 1773 to quarterly charge for use of the clearing house of 1960 points to an earlier and perhaps less definitely organized system of settlement. A house was taken for the purpose in 1810, in which year the number of banking houses who settled their accounts with each other at the clearing house was 46. Gilbert's History and Principles of Banking, page 78. The Bank of England has never been a member of the clearinghouse, though it, quote, clears on one side, end quote. That is, its claim on the clearing bankers is made through the clearinghouse, but the clearing bankers is made through the but the claims of the clearing bankers on the bank are forwarded direct to Threadneedle Street twice or thrice daily. Nor did the banks in Fleet Street or at Charing Cross belong to it. In 1858, the clearing of country checks was added through arrangements made by Lloyd Avebury, then Sir John Lubbock. So guys, check it out. Since 1858, there has been clearing houses. 1773, there has been clearing houses. Of what they're speaking about in modern times now, they're talking about clearing houses, right? We're talking about securities and all these different kind of things, checks. Since back in the 17th, look how far in the past these things has been going on, right? And all of us go to the banks, all of us do banking, and how many of us are aware of banking? How many of us could really say that we are experts in commercial paper? How many of us can say that? So he who doesn't learn from history doomed to repeat it, and he who doesn't allow history to be taught actually wants it to be repeated, right? So I wouldn't say the knowledge, the information was hidden from us. I would say we didn't take the time, or parents or great grandparents didn't take the time to learn. Maybe because they had to work every day, or they had to toil. I don't know. But guys, the information is here. We need to get wise and start to get to understand the system that we live in. All right. So nor did the banks in Fleet Street or at any Charing Cross belong to it. In 1858, the clearing of country checks was added through arrangements made by Lloyd Avebury, then Sir John Lubbock. The country clearing is a great assistance to business, as it enables a check drawn on the most distant village in England to be dealt with as conveniently as a check on London. Of the 49 banks in London in 1844, 26 were connected with the clearing house. At that time, only private banks were allowed to be members. In 1854, the joint stock banks made their way into that body, and in 1906, the numbers were 1 private bank and 18 joint stock banks who joined in the clearing, 19 banks in all. Practically, at the present time, every large transaction in the United Kingdom is settled by check. That is, by a series of ledger, transfers, notes, and specie, being the small change by which the fractional amounts are paid. A large proportion of these transactions are arranged through the operation of the London Clearing House. This is facilitated by the fact that every bank in the United Kingdom has an agent in London. The annual circulation shown by the London Clearing House is more than £12 billion. No one asks what stock of gold is held by the bank on which the checks are drawn, or what the bank itself keeps in reserve. The whole is taken in faith on a well-founded trust. On a well-founded trust. Everything is trust. Trust law, estates, property, assignments, transfers, interest in things, chosen action. Everything is trust. Well-founded trust. It is the most easily worked paper circulation and circulating medium in existence. Like the marvelous tent of the fairy Parabanoa, it expands itself to meet every want and contracts again the moment the strain is past. See the articles by R. H. Inglis Palgrave on gold and the Banks, Quarterly Review, January 1906. If we add to the returns of the London Clearing House those of the clearing houses in the large towns of England, Ireland, and Scotland, and the numerous exchanges which occur daily, and the large number which the different offices of banks with a great many branches settle among themselves, and the number drawn by one customer of a bank and paid to another, we may form some notion of the vast amount of the yearly turnover in checks. And remember, a check is an order. This may be roughly estimated to be at least twice as great as that registered by the London Clearing House. The earliest authentic statement as to the clearing is found in the appendix to the second report committee of House of Commons Banks of Issue 1841. In 1839, the figures of the London clearings were 954,401,600, 29 banks. In 1840, 978 million. In 1899, 9 billion. In 1900, 8 billion. In 1906, 12 billion. In 1695, shortly after the establishment of the Bank of England, the Scottish Parliament passed an act for the establishment of a public bank. Amongst the first names is that of Thomas Coutts, a name still commemorated in one of the most substantial banks in London. Right? We are under Scottish banks now. The terms of the establishment were more favorable than those connected with the establishment of the Bank of England, for they obtained the exclusive privilege of banking for 21 years without giving any consideration whatsoever. So for 21 years, private banks was running England, or was controlling the money supply in England, right? For 21 years. So now, in 1695, the Scottish Parliament passed an act to establish of a public bank. So now we want to talk about public bank in Scotland, right? It may have been the natural caution of the country, or the fact that William III was then king, which led to the Bank of Scotland being prohibited under a heavy penalty from lending money under any circumstances to the king. So when you guys check out the other read, there's another read I'm doing on my channel, America's Hope by Tom Schuff, talks about Federal Reserve notes versus United States notes, and this here is clearly explaining where private bankers issuing notes as opposed to the government issuing notes. All right, let's continue. I digress. It is the only Scottish bank established by Act of Parliament. So Scotland established a public bank. But the public bank faced heavy penalty from lending money under any circumstances to the king. So the private bankers were the only ones who wanted to lend money to the king. Because what would the king pledge to repay the money? Land, the property of his subjects. That was what the king would pledge. Right? Check out that read. Check out that read on America's Hope, Banks and America's and Trinidad Hope by Thomas Schuff, and compare what we are reading here now with what is being said in that book in modern times. And this is in the past. This is in history. And that book is talking about modern times. And see how nothing has changed and everything is properly well established. We continue. So it is the only Scottish bank established by Act of Parliament. The directors began at a very early period to receive deposits and to allow interest thereon, also to grant cash credit accounts. A minute of the a minute of the directors respecting the mode of keeping the latter being dated so far back as 1729. Though the system of branches forms now so marked a feature of banking in Scotland, a good many years had to pass before they obtained any hold. It was not till about the year 1700 that the directors of the Bank of Scotland established branches at Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee, and Montrose, but so little encouragement was given to these branches, the expenses far exceeding the profits arising from them, that the directors resolved to close them, because these banks were operating properly. These banks were holding the money, the specie of the people, and were lending the species of the people and had to be repaid the species of the people. In 1731, another attempt was made and agencies were established at Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Dundee. But after a trial of 2 years, they were discontinued. It was not till 1774 that branches were again established by the bank. So the public bank, the bank of the people, the bank the bank created by the representatives of the people, because remember the government is the people and the representatives are only selected out of the society by the people to represent the people as a whole. So when we talk about government, apart from one governing them own selves, we talk about the people. The members of parliament is not the government. They are representatives. They are trustees. So what we're seeing here is that the people were trying to establish their own banks because the private banks were sucking the wealth out of the country. Clearly. So after the establishment of the Bank of Scotland, the directors began to issue notes, or as they were then called, bills or tickets, for £100, £50, 20, 10, and 5. In 1704, £1 notes were issued for the first time. So they were issuing these notes as low down as £1 because the people, this is what the people could afford. In 1727, the Royal Bank of Scotland was established by a charter of incorporation which granted them perpetual succession and a common seal. There was a great rivalry between the two companies. The British Linen Company was incorporated in 1746 for the purpose of undertaking the manufacture of linen, but by 1763, they found it best to confine their operations to banking transactions. This bank also was incorporated by charter. The note circulation was always an important item in the Scottish banks. Thus, in the case of the Bank of Dundee, the receiving money from the public did not commence till 1792. Up to that time, the whole business of the bank from 1764 onwards, 28 years in all, had consisted in its issue of notes, which had varied from about £23,000 to £56,000. The Bank of Dundee was amalgamated with the Royal Bank of Scotland in 1864, when its deposits amounted in round figures to £700,000, and its note circulation to £41,000. After 1792, the money deposited with the banks in Scotland rapidly increased, but the habit of hoarding savings in a chest up to amounts of 10 or 20 pounds continued to a much later period. History of the Dundee Banking Company. Private banking never appears to have had any considerable hold in Scotland. In 1819, 8 private banks were in existence. These had all disappeared in 1844. In 1906, there were only 10 banks of issue in Scotland, which practically carried on the whole business of the country. There were 2 other small banks established comparatively recently. These 10 banks had in 1906 1,108 branches. The history of the growth and expansion of Scottish banking since 1826 is as far as can be traced as follows. We have a little table here. So we have date 1826. We have 21 million pounds deposits, 176. So the number of offices, 1 to every 13,170 inhabitants. 1841, 27 million. So we had 380 offices, 1 to every 6,600 inhabitants. 1856, we had 63 million and capital, 585 offices, 1 to every 5,230 inhabitants. 1872, we had 92 million, including all liabilities and capital. We had 790 offices, 1 to every 4,250 inhabitants. In 1906, we had 135 million and 42,000, including all liabilities and capital. We had 1,180 offices, 1 to every 3,790 inhabitants. So against every note issued in excess of the limit allowed by the Acts of 1844 to 1845, gold has to be held at the offices of the issuing banks in Scotland and Ireland. The amount of the specie to be thus held was, as explained by Sir Robert Peel in his speech of the 25th of April 1845, to be ascertained by the average amount of the note issue for 4 weeks preceding. The object of the holding of this amount of specie by the bank which issued the notes was designed by Sir Robert Peel to cause the circulating medium of the country, being partly of notes and partly of specie, to fluctuate in the same manner as if it had been a metallic circulation only. So Sir Robert Peel was keeping a balance of the notes and the specie. And remember, specie is gold, silver, right? The specie held in Scotland and Ireland against the note issue is not a special security for the note circulation, but is placed in the banks there for this purpose. So what they're saying here, the specie held in Scotland and Ireland against the note issue is not a special security for the note circulation, but is placed in the banks there for this purpose. So it's either the people was depositing the gold or the specie, or they or the directors or the shareholders of the bank were the ones depositing the gold, right? To be held to issue the notes. The influence ascribed to the working of the note circulation in the earlier part of the 19th century accounts for this legislation, which, as Sir Robert Peel stated in his speech of the 6th of May 1844, was intended to, quote, ensure the uniform equivalency of banknotes to coin. So they were trying to maintain a balance. All this monetization and securitization and fractional reserve banking and all this kind of nonsense that are taking place now, they were trying to maintain a balance. It is not applicable to the present position of the circulating medium of the United Kingdom, which now consists mainly of a circulation of checks. This differs absolutely from what was contemplated by Sir Robert Peel. No attempt is or can be made to cause such a paper circulation to fluctuate as if it were one of specie only. One result of the limitation of the power of note issue to the banks in Scotland, which possessed that power in 1845, has been that no important bank has been established in that country since. Notes are so largely employed in ordinary business in Scotland that a bank which does not possess the power practically cannot carry on business and supply the needs of its customers. This limitation in the number of the banks has, however, not been accompanied by any deficiency in the supply of banking accommodation to the people. There is a larger number of banking offices in proportion to the population in Scotland than in England and Wales or Ireland. The large number of branches must, however, be a cause of great expense. And in several other respects, it is obvious that a business carried on in such thinly peopled districts as are found in many parts of Scotland must be conducted at a disadvantage in comparison with those banks which deal with more active centres of commerce. Although the profit derived from their large issue of notes may be thought to be considerable, yet when we consider the many expenses incurred in conducting a large note circulation, the cost of printing, stamp duty, and the charges on importing gold from London when the circulation exceeds the limit fixed by the Act of 1845, no small deductions must be made from the apparent profit to be derived from this head, if there is any direct profit at all. On the other hand, the great number of branches possessed by the Scottish banks tends beyond doubt to their stability and prosperity. The network of banks on the surface of Scotland is as important to the development of the prosperity of the country as the network of the railways. It has caused a great economy of capital, as the universal practice of people, even of the most moderate means, is to lodge their money with the banks. It has caused a great economy of capital, as the universal practice of the people, even of the most moderate means, is to lodge their money with the banks, as we still do today. The early history of banking in Ireland was marked by legislation even less favorable to the formation of a steady and dependable system than in England, and in 1695 several of the principal merchants in Dublin met together for the purpose of forming a public bank for Ireland on the model of the Bank of England. So now they're going to model the public bank after the Bank of England in Ireland. Right? So you don't know what I mean. For many years, this proposal met with no favor. So why I think for many years it met with no favor? Because the Bank of England is a private bank, and the public bank was the bank that the people wanted to establish for them to store their valuables with, so that they could transact business honestly without anybody taking their substance wealth. And for many years, the proposal to form a public bank, model after the Bank of England in Ireland, was met with no favor. Well, why do you think it was met with no favor? It was not till 1783 that the Bank of Ireland was established and commenced its business. The first governor was David Latouche Jr., and two other members of his family were amongst the first board of directors. The bank met with very great success, but the jealousy against rival establishment was extreme. By the act forming the Bank of Ireland, it was enacted that no company or society exceeding 6 in number, except the Bank of Ireland, should borrow or take up money on their bills or notes payable on demand. So they're jealous, right? Because why? The more people get to issue their notes of the substance they're holding for the people. And then they had a reserve of what? A 10%. That means every bank that established will be taking a certain amount of wealth out of the other private banks and them, right? So that is why they was jealous. In the year 1821, the act was so far modified as to permit the establishment of banking companies exceeding 6 in number at a distance of 50 miles from Dublin. So you see, banks had to set up at a certain distance to capture a certain amount of people, right? So which means the money that they could have made was probably a balance. They weren't able to make more than the other by much, because it probably had, if we look at the figures here, 6,000, 5,000 to every one office, right? So in 1824, in consequence of the ambiguity of that act, an act had to be passed to explain it. So imagine they passed an act in 1824, and the act was so ambiguous that they had to pass another act to explain the act that they passed before. It was not till 1845 that the restriction as to the 50-mile limit was withdrawn. The establishment of any other bank but the Bank of Ireland was for a long time hindered by the legislation on the subject. And that is a monopoly. So remember, Bank of England had a monopoly. Now the Bank of Ireland have a monopoly. Some of the restrictions were so extraordinary that it will be interesting to refer to three of the more important acts. 1741-15, George II. Partnerships authorized for the purpose of trade and manufacture, but such partnerships were not to exceed 9 in number, nor was the capital stock of such co-partnership to exceed, and at any time, the sum of £10,000. 1780 to 1781, 21 and 22, George III. Anonymous Partnership Act. So people apparently they were trying to create an anonymous partnership to do banking. Limited liability not to exceed £50,000, but business of banking or discounters of money expressly excluded. So they couldn't even do banking to collect or discount. Discount means discount is to sell or purchase. When you're discounting something in banking terms, is to purchase or sell commercial paper. Right? 1759-33, Geo II. By this act, a person, while he continued a banker, could not make a marriage settlement on a son or daughter, a grandson or granddaughter, so as to be good against his creditors, though for a valuable consideration, and though such creditors were not creditors at the time the grant was made. This act gave power to creditors over all conveyances by bankers affecting real estates, and all dispositions after the 10th of May 1760 by bankers of real or leasehold interest therein. 2 or 4 children were made void as against creditors, though for valuable consideration, though not creditors at the time. No banker to issue notes or receipts bearing interest after the 10th of May 1760. Some of these enactments appear to be in force at the present day. Suggestions have been made, though apparently unsuccessfully, for their repeal. See the kind of men was taking their claim. And that's how I seen it. Back in those days, men was taking their claim because they saw the future. They wanted to create something for their posterity, so men was taking their claim. They weren't sitting home and watching TV and gambling and drinking rum by the side of the road. They was taking their claim. So extraordinary were the views of the common people that a banker in Dublin of the name of Beresford, having made himself very unpopular, a large assemblage of ignorant country people having previously collected a quantity of Beresford's notes, publicly burned them, crying out with enthusiasm, while the promises to pay on demand were consuming. What will he do now? His bank will surely break. The number of banks which failed in Ireland in earlier times was extraordinary. Thus, Sir Robert Peel, in his speech of the 9th of June 1845 on the Bank Act of that year, made a quotation. Quote, from the report of the Committee of Irish Exchanges, which sat in 1804, at that period there were 50 registered banks, but they all failed, and their failures I know personally led to the most fearful distress. End quote. Since the legislation of 1845, however, the business has been carried on with equally extraordinary steadiness and success, and at the present time is on a footing fully equal to that of any other part of the United Kingdom. The earlier history of banking in Ireland pursued very closely the same process of development as in England. Circulation preceded and fed deposits. The credit which the banks obtained by the ready acceptance of their notes brought customers to their counters, and thus the existing system, fortunate and excellent managers, was built up gradually and surely. Alone in the three kingdoms, Ireland maintains the same limit of authorized circulation as that established by Peel's Act of 1845. Not one of the 6 banks which had the privilege of issue at that period has lost it since. The names of the banks carrying on business in Ireland, the years when they were established, and their position in 1906 are as follows. capital of Irish joint stock banks in 1906. So the name of banks and year when established. So you have the Bank of Ireland, 1783, the Hibernian Bank, 1824, thus marked asterisk, thus marked, and not banks of issue. So all the banks with the asterisk are not banks of issue. All right. So the Bank of Ireland, the Hibernian Bank, not a bank of issue, 1824, the Provincial Bank, 1825, the Northern Banking Company, 1825, Belfast Banking Company, 1827, National Bank, 1835, Ulster Banking Company, 1836, Royal Bank, not a issuing bank, 1836, the Munster Bank Limited, 1864. And these are the figures here. Capital paid up. The highest is 2 million, right? And most of them $500,000 down to 200,000. Rate of dividend per annum, right? 1836, the rate of dividend per annum. So banking, like every other business, has to pass through periods of difficulty. The severity of these in the case of banking is intensified by the vast number of interests affected. So we know we're going into banking crises. These, on the other hand, are worldwide in their scope. On the other, they touch every home in the country. The stringency of such a time in England has, since the passing of the Act of 1844, been greatly enhanced by a doubt being sometimes felt as to whether a relaxation of the Act of 1844 would be allowed. In any case, some little time must elapse before the assent of the ministers of the Crown to the request of the Bank of England can be known. Since 1844, there have been 5 periods of pressure during 1847, 1857, 1866, 1870, and 1890. Of these, in 3, 1847, 57, and 66, the difficulties reached panic. The crisis of 1847 was brought on by the speculation in railway enterprise, which had gone on since 1845. So little had the anxieties of the autumn been anticipated that the bank rate of discount was 3% on the 1st of January. Remember, discount is to purchase commercial paper, right? To buy commercial paper or sell commercial paper. It was raised to 3.5% on the 14th and to 4% on the 21st. It became 5% on the 8th of April, 5.5% on the 5th, 6% on the 30th of September, and 8% on the 25th of October. This was the highest. It was lowered to 7% on the 22nd of November, on the 2nd of December to 6%, and on 23rd of December to 5%. An announcement was made on the 1st of October that no advances would be made on public securities. This was followed by general anxiety and alarm. The reserve of the bank was rapidly reduced to a very low ebb. Guys, you all need to go and listen to that read on Thomas Schaff. He goes into all this, how banks increase and reduce deposits to create contraction in society so that borrowers or people will not be able to repay their loans, so they could foreclose on their assets. You all need to go and listen to that read. I'm reading this and I'm seeing clearly as to what is taking place here. So the Bank of England Reserve of Specie, 1847, 16th of October, 3 million. 20th of October, 1,900,000. 30th of October, 1,600,000. So meanwhile, the anxiety and alarm prevailing were causing a general hoarding of coin and banknotes. And it really appeared not unlikely that the banking department of the Bank of England might be compelled to stop payment while there was more than 6 million of specie in the issue department. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir C. Wood, afterwards Lord Halifax, was urged by many deputations and remonstrances to relax the Bank Act, but he declined. At last, on the 22nd and 23rd of October, some of the leading city bankers had an interview with the Prime Minister, Lord John, afterwards Earl Russell, and on their explaining the necessities of the position, the desired relaxation was given. The official letter, 25th October, recommended, quote, the directors of the Bank of England in the present emergency to enlarge the amount of their discounts and advances upon approved security. Is this not what taking place today with all these bailouts and all these different things? What it is happening to the assets that the people deposited? What happening to the assets? We have the same thing going on today. Bailouts. A high rate, 8%, was to be charged to keep these operations within reasonable limits. A bill of indemnity was promised if the arrangement led to a breach of the law. The extra profit derived was to be for the benefit of the public. The effect of the government letter in allaying the panic was complete. The crisis of 1857 was the last occasion of an official inquiry. The crisis of 1857 was the last occasion of an official inquiry where the banks had to give an inquiry of their books, statements of their books. This is contained in the report and evidence of the Select Committee of the House of Commons on the Bank Acts 1857 to 1858. The evidence given by Mr. Sheffield Neve, the governor, and Mr. Bonamy Dobry, deputy governor of the bank in 1858, gives a vivid picture not only of what occurred, but of what might be expected to recur on such occasions. The wildest alarm prevailed. Exchequer bills were scarcely sealable, and the bank itself sold £3,000,000 government securities at a considerable loss. The extreme pressure was relaxed by the letter issued by the government on the 12th of November 1857, signed by Lord Palmerston, the Premier, and Sir G.C. Lewis, which allowed a temporary relaxation of the Bank Act of 1844. The public alarm, however, was so great that it was not until the 21st of November that the severity of the pressure was in any way diminished. People lost trust in the banks. On the 20th of November, the notes issued to the public on securities beyond the statutory limit, then 14 million, reached the sum of £928,000. By the next week, the issue was almost down to the limit, and in the week following, it was within the limit. On the 1st of January 1858, the bank rate was lowered to 8%, and the anxiety gradually passed away. Had the Treasury letter been issued earlier, the pressure might not have been so severe, and the governor of the bank expressed a strong opinion that if it had been later, it would not have been sufficient. November 1857 was the only occasion when the limits of the Bank Act as to issue were actually passed. During the crisis of May 1866, £4 million left the bank on one-day notes and coin, and the reserve of the bank was reduced in the return of the 1st of June of that year to £415,000. People were hoarding. The bank rate was raised to 10%, and permission was given by the government to suspend the act. This, however, was not done. Tradition says that the bank asked the bankers during the period of heaviest pressure of that terrible crisis, pressure more severe than anything that had taken place before or that has occurred since, to pay in every night the notes they had drawn or out in the morning, which were still in their tills at the close of the day, and that hence the legal limit was never exceeded. But it was not till the 6th of August that the rate was reduced to 8%. The effect of the crisis of October 1890 was far less severe. This was due to the judgment and skill displayed by the governor, Mr. Lidderdale, and the directors of the bank, who imported £3 million in gold from Paris. The reserve in that year never dropped below £10 million, and before the end of November, the anxiety had greatly passed away. Caution prevailed, but not panic, and the distinction is a very clear one. See articles on Crises, Dictionary of Political Economy, Volume 1. The most important requirement of banking in the United Kingdom is still the establishment of an efficient specie reserve. The reserve in the banking department of the Bank of England averaged 8,500,000 in 1845, in 1855 8,400,000, in 1865 8 million, 1875 11,600,000, in 1885 15,100,000, in 1895 29,900,000. in 1906, 23 million, what's that? 500,000. This provides but a narrow basis for the whole business requirements of the country. Though much larger than in several previous years, it cannot be regarded as adequate. All right, so we're going to stop there, guys. We're going to take it up from the reserve question on the next read. So listen to it. Let us sink in. Go listen to that read on America's Hope by Thomas Schaff and compare what Thomas Schaff is saying in there. Because while you read these books, you'll realize that you have to read between the lines. They're not going to tell you everything straightforward. You have to read other documents and other books. That's why most of these books have citations. So they will quote one line from a citation, a book, but you will have to now go to that book and read that book to really get to fit the pieces of the puzzles together. Everything is not in one book. But when you compare, when you read and you get the exposure and the understanding of what took place and what is taking place today, when you read these books, you will see clearly what is happening. All right? So thank you for your time, guys. Remember, strengthen body, powers, and mind. We keep moving forward. We keep learning and expanding the mind. All right? Stay up.